Welcome to Living on Earth. I am your host, Alistair Gilmore. Today we are talking, I've always wanted to do a nature show, but I wouldn't know what to talk about since I'm about as outdoorsy as a ping pong table. So a nature show would be well outside of my purview. Everything else, though, well inside of my purview. Anyway, I've got my coffee. I've got my flowers, which is exciting. Kelsey is producing today's show. Say hi, Kelsey. Hi. Yep, there she is. And we're good. So anyway, the Angry Moderate for, what is this, February 9th, 2012. February 9th, the middle of, what's it called, when the Republicans are all like eating each other alive and trying to get the nomination for president. The primaries, the primary race is going on between four upstanding men. That's a knee slapper, upstanding. Mitt Romney, no comment. Rick Santorum, you've got to be kidding me. Ron Paul, hello. And my favorite of all, named after that unctuous little beast that crawls around in brooks, called a newt, Newt Gingrich, probably one of the slimiest political figures I have ever seen in my 49 years of seeing. Although, of course, in my first few years of seeing, I wasn't quite as sentient as I am now with regard to political figures. I was much more concerned with wiffle ball and with Nerf football than I was with politics and economics. And I got to be honest with you, there's part of me that wishes that wiffle ball and Nerf football were still the preeminent concerns in my existence. But instead, I make do with the op-ed page of the newspaper and listening to right-wing political talk shows and rolling my eyes so far back in my head that I look like Mr. Spock in Star Trek when he's in the middle of one of his trances, you know, when he's deep in the Plaktow, the blood fever. Did you ever see this Star Trek episode? The old Star Trek episode where he and Kirk end up fighting, you know, because he chooses Kirk as the suitor, or his wife-to-be chooses Kirk as her defender, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the head of Vulcan, the most important person on the planet of Vulcan, is named DePau, you know, and she has a German accent. It's like, yes, Kirk, do you accept the challenge? And I'm like, why the hell does someone on Star Trek have a German accent? Like, is there like a Germanic part of the planet Vulcan? You know, like, anyway. So let's talk about economics and politics, since the show is about economics and politics, and I will have some more caffeine. Anybody who ever tells you that caffeine and coffee are not good for you is sabotaging the very basic happiness of your existence. I would make the following argument that if someone were to say to me, what are the top 5 things? What are the top 5 things, Dan, that you just couldn't do without? I would start with my family, because, and then I would go chocolate, coffee, chocolate, and I would just go, that's it, chocolate and coffee, the rest of the list. And then like down way at the bottom of the list, I would find something like, and I don't know, music, right? Coffee and chocolate. Don't like to mix them though. Don't really like flavored coffee. So, anyway, I don't know what to say about the primaries. These men, as I mentioned in the last show a couple of weeks ago, these men who are running for office, and this is not the providence of the political right, the left is the same way. These men, and they predominantly are men, are, and I mean that in the best of ways, for you women out there who are saying, oh, he's like being prejudiced against women. No, I'm actually complimenting you, because what I'm saying is that the men out there are a bunch of jackasses, and the fact that you women are not kind of engaged in that, except for a few like kind of morons like Michelle Bachmann and Sarah Palin and a couple others. The fact that you're not sort of part of that is really good. Like, that's a good thing. But these men who are running for political office, whether they be on the right or on the left, are completely disingenuous, utterly false, totally calculated, completely hypocritical. The list of their character flaws is so long that it's mind-boggling. If they went to confession, they would be like, well, yeah, I got a pretty long list here. Yeah, I lied, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 114 times today. during that one interview, and that, you see, that's just extraordinary. So I try not to even listen to these debates, or because I don't think that the men at this point who are participating in the debates have anything genuine to say, ever. And if Barack Obama were participating, I would say the same thing. I think that what they do is they get up, they figure out what are going to be the most impactful sound bites, the most impactful facial expressions, the most impactful sound of their voices, and they practice that. But when it comes to actually saying something in which they truly believe and that's truthful and that's honorable, come on, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Politics in this country is the providence of scoundrels. And I'd even go further. I think that politics in this country has been completely and utterly co-opted by moneyed interests. There are virtually no working class members of the political establishment. Everybody who's part of the political establishment, virtually everybody, is part of the top 1% or the top 5% of wealthy people in this nation. It is a joke. We are a banana republic. We used to be a democratic republic, maybe a quasi-democratic republic. We are moving toward banana republicanism. And I don't mean that in terms of Republicans and Democrats. I mean that in terms of the nation itself is becoming a banana republic. We are ruled by a super wealthy group of individuals who capture all of the economic growth, supposed growth that takes place based upon the loose monetary policies of the Federal Reserve, yada, yada, yada. I've been babbling about this, since I crawled out of my crib and fell on my forehead, which may be why I babble about this stuff. Back when I was 2 years old. I've been babbling about this stuff since the 1970s, that we have a political establishment that is increasingly completely out of touch with the rest of us. I love it when Mitt Romney says, I'm not really worried about the poor people. They're taken care of. Really? 310 million Americans, the poor people are taken care of? There was a story on NPR just yesterday where about an individual in Detroit, Michigan, whose job it is to try and get children in Detroit to not miss public school, like to go to school. And the story detailed sort of his day going from house to house, motels, cars, trying to find people who are truant from school. Why are they truant? Oh, well, mom is a single mom and she lives with 6 kids in a hotel. And they don't have clothes. I'm Mitt Romney, and I think the poor are just fine. And as a matter of fact, when I become president, I'm going to make sure that job creation is the most important thing, even if those jobs pay $7.25 an hour, because then once someone has a $7.25 an hour job, we can take them off all social programs. No more food stamps, no more health insurance, because that is wasteful government spending. Right? These guys are destroying the nation. Anyway, that's not what I came to talk about. I came to talk about the draft. No, I didn't come to talk about the draft. There is no military draft, you know that. But what was that song? Remember? Who said that? That's not what I came to talk about. I came to talk about the draft. See, there's this Whitehall Street, right? Arlo Guthrie, Alice's Restaurant. I'm sure you've heard that, right? If you haven't heard Alice's Restaurant, what are you doing? Go out right now. Well, I guess you don't have to go out right now. We don't have to go out anymore when we want to listen to music. We can just go to our whatevers, our iPads, iPhones, and download, the Alice's Restaurant app, right? But you need to listen to Alice's Restaurant. You need to listen to Arlo Guthrie. That whole album is a genius album. Fantastic. But that's really not what I came to talk about. I came to talk about the economy, and I came to talk about the political right, and in particular today, I came to talk about the appellate court decision to overturn Proposition 8 in California. Now, if I'm not mistaken, I think I've got the number right, Proposition 8 was the voter initiative in which the citizens of California voted to ban same-sex marriage. Okay, so now we need to stop here. Because if I were one of the Republican candidates for president, I would lie now. See, I would lie. What I would do is I'd sit there and I'd go, You know, I think that everybody has a right to their own privacy in this nation. Our nation was built upon the idea of privacy, but I don't think that gays and lesbians should be getting married. Well, why don't you think, Mr. Romney, that gays and lesbians should be able to marry? Well, first of all, it says so in the Bible. It does? Yes, and those are God's words, and so I don't think that we should be going against what God says about men. Really? Why else, Mr. Romney, do you think we shouldn't, that there shouldn't be the choice for two human beings who love each other to choose to wed, right? Well, to be honest with you, would say Mr. Romney, it kind of gives me the wiggies, you know. I mean, these guys, man, are unbelievable. These people, and I'll tell you what, all these people in California who voted against same-sex marriage, not only shame on you, but like, what are you doing? What are you doing? You know, 30 years ago, was it 40 years ago? Oh, you weren't allowed to get married in certain parts of the country if you were of different, skin was a different color. Oh, no, we don't want that to happen, do we? We don't. What? 40 years later, we could care less, right? Jews marrying Christians and Buddhists marrying Hindus and black people marrying white people. Who cares? Two people love each other. Who cares? If a man loves a man and they want to get married, mazel tov. Fantastic. Have a wonderful wedding. Have a wonderful life. It's a beautiful thing. If two women love each other, great. Get married, wonderful. But not to the conservative political right. Because they don't really believe in the idea of privacy. It's a lie, you see. It's a lie. What they're really trying to do, first of all, the majority of people who are opposed to same-sex marriage are not opposed to it on any moral grounds or ethical grounds. They're opposed to it because they just makes them uncomfortable. Well, it's just not my thing. Fine. It's just not your thing. No one said it has to be your thing. Right? That's number one. Number two, the fact that these people on the right, and I know I harp on the political right more than I do on the left, but guess what? The right deserves to be harped on more. The political right deserves to be harped on more because the political right is more hypocritical than the left. The left may be more self-righteous than the right. I'm with you there. The political left, you know, when you get those people on the political left who are like, well, I believe in what Gandhi said. And I'm like, oh boy, I start to get a brain cramp right there. There are times when people on NPR, I'll be listening and someone from the left will be talking and they'll be using words like, you know, it's magical when I feel empowered. And I'm like, turn off the radio. I have to turn it off right then because I'm like, I can't hear the word magical and I can't hear the word empowered. Too self-righteous. Now, the left, and I think that that's, by the way, one of the reasons that the right reacts so strongly to the left. It's because of oftentimes the people on the left, it's their affect. It's that kind of self-righteous, self-aggrandizing affect that people on the left sometimes have. But people on the right side of the political spectrum is full of this untruth. Whereas on the one hand, they'll say, yes, we totally believe in the idea of freedom and individual liberty, but not if it means two men getting married and doing what they do together. No way. Well, what? So anyway, you have these people in California who vote to ban same-sex marriage in California. Now, people on the right, on the political right, and some on the left, would say, hey, look, this is a democracy. If 52% of the people say that we should not have same-sex marriage, then that should be the law. And then I say to myself, but our founders, the founders of this nation, had some wisdom. One of the ways in which they had some wisdom was by creating this thing called the Electoral College. Now, you're going to sit there at home and you're going to say, oh, the Electoral College, what a sham that is. And then I'm going to explain to you one of the reasons why the Electoral College exists, and you're going to still say, oh, no. But maybe deep down in your brain you'll be saying, oh, that's kind of interesting. One of the reasons that you have an electoral college and that electors are sent from states to cast their votes for president is if the people elect some right-wing fascist dictator, Nazi scumbag, or they elect some left-wing total, nut bar, gun-toting, gorilla, head case. If the people are so mesmerized, the population, by some extremist, the folks who are part of the Electoral College, the electors who go off to actually cast their votes for the presidency, may be people who are more moderate, right? And who look at what the population said and say, I can't follow the will of my constituency because my constituency, with glazed eyes, a la Repo Man, when the parents are sitting in front of the TV, we gave all of our money to the reverend, right? The people became so glassy-eyed and transfixed by some, right-wing zealot who was very, charismatic or articulate, that they lost their minds and they voted for somebody like Le Pen in France, right? Le Pen, right? Nazi. And the reason that the Electoral College, there's some wisdom to that, of course, is that the electors then go off to this convention, and if they think that the people are out of their minds and have elected some kind of total extremist, they can say, I'm not going to vote for who my constituency sent me to vote for. I'm going to vote for a more moderate candidate. So in theory, you could have someone, of course, who doesn't get the majority of the popular vote, but who wins the presidency. And I think that that's a good thing. That's a good thing. You want moderate people casting ballots in a reasonable fashion and not being mesmerized by the forked tongues and the great charismatic articulateness of potential extremist scumbags. Anyway, so you have these 52% of Californians who, for whatever reason, decided they were going to vote against gay marriage. And I bet you that well over half of them voted against same-sex marriage because either it just makes them uncomfortable, but they wouldn't admit that, or because somehow it's against God's teaching. And of course, the beauty of we being human beings is, well, we don't really know, do we? God's teaching. We have, some ideas about spirituality, and we follow some doctrines because it helps us be spiritual. But the truth is, he hasn't talked to any of us recently. And by the way, anybody out there in TV land, if he has talked to you and you're having or she, and you're having a conversation and you're hearing his or her voice, that could be a problem. Anyway, so you've got all these folks who are voting against same-sex marriage. And the Republicans, the right wing, the people, the conservatives, not all of them, of course. I know I'm generalizing. I know I'm a pain. The people on the right say, oh, well, you've got to go with the popular sentiment. We can't have activist courts reversing the will of the people. I want activist courts reversing the will of the people when the will of the people is insane. When the people vote 52 to 48% in a state to not allow two people who love each other to get married. What? Do you know, I guarantee you this. In 20 years, we are going to look, either in 20 years, we're going to be, the next Albania, or more likely, in 20 years, we're going to still be the United States of America, kind of plodding along, trying to figure it all out. And we're going to look back on this debacle, this embarrassment of having this debate about whether people who are of the same sex should be able to get married. And we're going to look back on that and we're going to be like, oh, that was not our most glorious moment as a nation. It's a little embarrassing that we were having this conversation. Because who cares? If two people love each other and they're the same sex or the same, who can of course, get married. Beautiful, fabulous. I think that the political right, and I look at these folks, these men and these women who are running for president on the right side of the political spectrum, and they are bigots, they are prejudiced, they are homophobic, they cry on the one hand, like John Boehner, right? John Boehner cried the other day. The President Obama's ruling with regard to birth control and education and the Catholic Church is an assault on religious freedom in this nation, right? This great self-righteous cry that it's an assault on religious freedom. And in the very same breath, though, he would be against same-sex marriage. Oh, it's an assault on religious freedom, but when it comes to the freedom of two people who love each other to want to get married, whoa, that's a different story. But Mr. Boehner, why is it really, deep down, Lie down on my couch, Mr. Boehner. Now, tell me about your mother. No, I do not want to know about your mother, Mr. Boehner. Mr. Boehner, why is it deep down you are under my spell? You have been hypnotized. The Jade Scorpion. Did you ever see that movie? Woody Allen. The Jade Scorpion has you under a spell. Mr. Boehner, tell me, why is it? I sound like Ricardo Montalban now. Why is it, Tattoo, that we are here on Fantasy Island? Yes. Why is it, Mr. Boehner, that you oppose same-sex marriage? And deep in his trance, unable to lie, he would say, it just makes me uncomfortable. It just gives me the willies. It just, fine. You don't have to be comfortable with two men or two women who are in love. You don't have to be comfortable with that, but that doesn't mean that your discomfort should mean that you should create legislation that prohibits those two people from living life the same way you do. Look, I happen to be uncomfortable with the fact that all of these super wealthy jerks run our nation. But I guess they, at least under the present system, they have the right to. I'm kind of hoping that we could figure out a way politically to take some of the money out of politics. By the way, let's talk about money in politics for a second. And so you realize this is my chance to really lay into the political left, right? I know that I don't give I'm not an equal opportunity critic. Do you ever listen to, listen to AM radio some night. If you're driving somewhere, just scan the AM dial. Listen to some of these right-wing guys. They're extraordinary. And you realize why they're doing it, by the way. You realize why Savage and why Glenn Beck and why Rush Limbaugh and why Sean Hannity, why all these guys do this right-wing talk show thing. For the money. It's brilliant. Even though they are single-handedly leading a following of lemmings, of conservative lemmings into the sea of austerity and to the sea of their own despair, they do it because they get rich. But let's talk for a second about the Obama administration's recent about-face on the super PACs. Now, I'll give the Obama team this. They have essentially said, look, we're still opposed to the super PACs, but we're not going to allow the Republican side to have tens of millions of dollars in extra money for their campaign that we could have if we appealed to our voter base to support our liberal super PAC, right? But there's some hypocrisy in there, isn't there? That the political left has decided, because they are afraid of the advantage that the political right would gain with regard to the Romney super PAC, that the political left has said, well, I guess this one time we'll just have to make an exception. Now, I understand that choice, and I think that if the political left was being completely honest, they would say, look, we're horrified at the idea that we would have a right-wing conservative president and a conservative Congress, because that would mean austerity measures that were pretty dramatic. And we all know that in the near term, if you have austerity, in the near term, you have economic calamity. You know that. You know that one of the reasons that Europe is kind of reeling and trying to figure out what the heck it's going to do is that all of these nations of Europe are looking at austerity measures to try and bring their budgets back into alignment. And austerity means cutting social spending and cutting the wages of public sector workers. And what you have then, of course, is you have more and more people who are have-nots, and they get angry, and you have social upheaval. And then when you have social upheaval, you have the right-wing and the left-wing extremists who are able to capitalize on that, and you end up with a lot of violent conflagration, right? We know that. That's History 101. So there is something about the political left in the United States saying, look, we're not going to allow the right to have an economic advantage in this election season because we are horrified at the prospect that we would lose the election based upon our moral, saying that we morally believe in something and we're going to not have the same amount of money and blah, blah, blah. And then you end up with the Romney administration or the Gingrich administration, and, everybody's moving to Quebec, right? All the people in Vermont and New Hampshire are like, getting in the car and being like, let's see, how long will it take me to get to Montreal because I'm done with this for 4 years. However, I don't think the Democrats, I don't know if they're completely honest about these super PACs. I think that the Democrats, I think that people on the political left are oftentimes just as prone to rationalizing and to using semi-truths and half-truths as a way to justify certain actions. And I got to tell you, I mean, I look at the Obama administration's actions over the past 3 years since President Obama was elected. And there are a lot of things about his administration and the actions of his administration that are mind-boggling for me. Number one, hiring Tim Geithner to be the Treasury Secretary, former Goldman Sachs lackey, having Bob Rubin as one of his major monetary czars. By the way, I don't mind the whole czar thing, right? It doesn't matter. But Bob Rubin, Goldman Sachs. I mean, all these people who are part of that Wall Street establishment, who are the mega multi-millionaires and billionaires, who are giving economic advice to our president. Now, they're not giving economic advice to our president based upon some kind of moral and ethical compass. They're giving economic advice to him based upon their knowledge of the financialized world. They're basically able to say, look, this is what these structured vehicles are about, and these are what these collateralized debt obligations are about, and this is why we need to make sure that we bail out the following institutions, because if we don't bail out the following institutions, then you're going to have a cascade of defaults. We have to bail out AIG, and the reason we have to give AIG $750 billion is because of all these obligations that they have and all of these credit default swaps, that if these swaps are somehow are allowed to default and people are asking for money that can't be paid back, then you're going to have a sort of that next leg down of the Great Recession. So I understand that is their argument, but have the Democrats in any way, shape, or form put forward any policies that are truly will change the financial system in a way to not level the playing field? I'm not saying that, but just to make cheating illegal, and to make sure that top 1% doesn't become so super wealthy that they rule the country de facto. They rule the nation. No, the Democrats haven't done that. They've enacted little policies like, oh yeah, we're going to hire someone and that person's going to look out for the consumer. And President Obama, who is just as guilty as the political figures on the right for using his oratory and his eloquence and the bully pulpit to convince us that what he is saying is righteous and true, has gone up and made all kinds of speeches about how we're doing a great job of reforming the financial system. No, we're not. No, we're not. If we were truly reforming the financial system, the Federal Reserve would not monetize $500 billion in debt, and that $500 billion would not go into the pockets of the top 1%. It wouldn't. The money supply that is being created by all of the Federal Reserve's actions doesn't make it down to me and you, if you're part of the 99%. It doesn't trickle down. How's your salary at your job? How are your wages? Have they gone up demonstrably in the last 4 years? Are you looking for work? Are you partially employed, unemployed, underemployed? Are you able to find, as a 50-year-old, a career that is remunerative in a way that you're able to keep up with inflation? When we monetize trillions of dollars of debt, what happens to the cost of things? It goes through the roof because the top 1%, I know I'm using that term loosely, the banks and those individuals are able to get a hold of that money. They bid up the cost of commodities. They bid up the price of everything out there. I can't afford to pay $4 a gallon for gasoline. Kidding me? But that's not the concern of the Democrats. The Democrats aren't concerned with changing the economic system. The Democrats aren't concerned with making sure that people like me and possibly people like you are able to make ends meet and have an economic future that seems plausible and have a future that makes sense financially. That's not their concern. Their concern is A, getting reelected, B, creating social programs that are liberal-minded, social programs that take care of people who are struggling, but they don't change the system. It's the entire system that would need to be changed in order for there to be you need to have a financial system in which you don't have a central bank that creates trillions in wealth, and those trillions in wealth are captured by only a teeny minority of people, because those people are the people who have access to that money. I don't have access to that money. That money doesn't make its way down to local banks that then lend to me at a very low interest rate. You know, when the Federal Reserve sets its interest rate, you know, it's prime lending, whatever the lending rate, losing the words here, at 0%. An institution like a Goldman Sachs can borrow at an extraordinarily low rate and just throw it into a different reserve account at the Federal Reserve at a little bit higher rate, do nothing, and make millions of dollars in interest doing nothing. And then pay their executives millions of dollars and say, oh, we're doing God's work here at Goldman Sachs. And spend their money on what? Oh, and then they go out to dinner at the restaurant at which I'm working and leave me a bigger tip? What? Coffee. I think that people who go out, I think that when you go out to dinner, this is coming from a waiter and a bartender, I think that when you go out to dinner, like you should tip not based upon the check, you should tip based upon how much you can afford to tip. Most of us who are out there waiting tables are just getting by, right? Especially if you wait tables at, like, Denny's. But I'm saying, even if you're waiting tables at a nice restaurant, you get to the end of a week and you're like, okay, so gas, food, rent, this is going to be an interesting week. Let's see. I could put some of the Crisco oil in the gas tank and see what happens there. And I could use the rest of the Crisco oil for some food. No, but one of the reasons that I've worked in restaurants in the past is because you get fed, right? At the end of the night, they're like, okay, staff meal. And I'm like, yes, staff meal. May I have lots of food, right? And then, of course, you're anyway. But I think, like, if you're really like, someone in that top 1%, you go out to dinner, you get your filet and your nice bottle of wine, your check comes to $100. Yeah, leave a $500 tip for the waiter, right? Waiter would love that. Really helpful. Help him or her pay off his or her student loans. What's $500 for you? Anyway, I know that's a little silly, but think about it. Why don't we take a little break, let the viewers out there change the channel, because I'm sure they're just sick of my self-righteous ranting, and we'll take a little break and then we'll come back. See you guys in a couple minutes. We're back on the Angry Moderate Show. It's February 9th, 2012, and we haven't covered too much today. We've covered a little bit of this and a little bit of that. If you've missed so far what I've covered, you've missed a really entertaining and if I might say so myself, quite brilliant dissection and interrogation of the political establishment, right and left, mostly right, and a little bit of discussion of the monetary fallacy with regard to the Federal Reserve's monetary policy. But for the last part of the show, I just want to go back to something I've been talking about for many, many years now here in the Upper Valley, which is that the economic difficulties that we are going to continue to face in the future. Now, there are many of you out there who are saying to yourselves right now, but Dan, the stock market seems to have stabilized and continues to go up. The unemployment rate, the U3, or the sort of official unemployment, not the underemployment, but the unemployment rate has gone down to 8.3%. And I know that by now you know about the Bureau of Labor Statistics and how they fudge the numbers. By the way, that was a left-wing thing. That was Bill Clinton's administration. Clinton said, I don't like the fact that in my administration unemployment doesn't seem to be doing so well, so let's change the rules as to how unemployment is measured. And that's one of the reasons that unemployment looks better. But I know that you are seeing and listening in the news and thinking, well, we are having what's known as a recovery, but my position is that you can never have a true economic recovery when that recovery is based upon loose monetary policy. Translation essentially is printing money, not printing, but virtual. Loose monetary policy when all of that money that's being created is simply being grabbed up by a very small portion of corporations and individuals who are using that money to then gamble in the stock markets or to gamble in the commodities markets or to enhance their own wealth, kind of feed off each other to build up the price of things, when there are another 300 million people who aren't really benefiting from that. I mean, you look at the unemployment rate at 8.3%. Now, where are the majority of these jobs? What are the majority of these jobs? Well, the majority of these jobs are in the retail sector and in the healthcare sector, but predominantly these jobs are no health insurance, $10 to $12 an hour jobs. Now, you know, when I was growing up, I mean, if you made $12 an hour, I mean, when I was just out of college, I mean, I was making about $14,000 or $15,000 a year working, not as a full-time teacher, but in education, and that was certainly sufficient. I mean, $14,000 a year, so obviously it wasn't a lot, but I mean, my rent was a couple $100 a month. I didn't have car payments. You know, I was driving an old jalopy. Food, the cost of food, you'd go to the market and spend $35 and come home with 5 or 6 grocery bags of food for $35 or $40. So that $14,000 was, you know, could get me by, not a family, but an individual. Now, I mean, an individual making $30,000 a year, $25,000 to $30,000 a year, is going to have a heck of a difficult time making ends meet between the cost of housing, whether that be rent or home ownership, the cost of fuel, the cost of food, all of these things that have been victimized, all of these things that are part of the inflationary schematic. When you inflate the money supply, by definition, you end up inflating the cost of things, because the cost of things tends to correlate pretty closely with the money supply. So as the price of things goes up, there's only a small amount of people who have access to enough money so that they are not directly impacted, or in a very dramatic way, by those inflationary dynamics. But the majority of people are dramatically impacted by those inflationary dynamics. And you see that in this environment where you have $10, $12, $13, $14 an hour jobs, that is not sufficient to make ends meet. So you have married couples, or, you know, people who are, you know, partnered, whether that be same-sex or not, right? Mr. Republican, who cares? You have people who are together, maybe both of them are making $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year, and even on that combined salary of 80 or 90 grand, there are still a lot of strains. You know? So this idea that we are in the midst of an economic recovery because the Federal Reserve is pumping trillions of dollars into the economy and bailing out banks and monetizing debt. You know, the Treasury says we'll issue $500 billion in bonds, and China and Japan and the Gulf states say we don't want anything to do with those, and the Federal Reserve says we'll take them, and then the Federal Reserve puts that $500 billion into reserve accounts of, like, the Treasury Department at the Federal Reserve. Those monies, contrary to what people on the right say, and this again is just another one of those extraordinary lies that people on the political right conjure up, that somehow somehow with the wealth that's created through whatever means, the wealth that's created makes its way, or as Ronald Reagan would say, what was his name? What was the name of the economist? Friedman. That these monies might trickle down to the rest of society. It's simply not true. It may trickle down in certain small ways and keep the economy from contracting dramatically, but it's a slow deterioration of the ability of people in the middle class or former middle class to make ends meet. And so what you end up having is you have a damned if you do or damned if you don't kind of scenario. Okay? On the one hand, if we have a Republican administration and a Republican Congress and they decide to pull the plug on loose monetary policy and kick Ben Bernanke out and bring in someone who's much more hawkish when it comes to monetary policy, and you have a pulling of the plug of monetary policy, then you end up having a precipitous drop back into recession and possibly even depression, because it's that inflated money supply that's keeping things kind of from falling apart. On the other hand, however, if you continue on with the policies that you have now, where you have loose monetary policies, low interest rates, money printing, I know that that's not the right word, but accommodating monetary policies, all kinds of plans of the Federal Reserve to make sure that there is money available, if that's your strategy, you create more and more wealth for an increasingly small group of people, like a group of people that becomes smaller and smaller and wealthier. And you have a middle class that finds it increasingly difficult to make ends meet because the cost of things keeps going up. So you're kind of stuck, right? Unless you reform the monetary system altogether and you figure out a way to make sure that money is no longer created by private institutions called banks through the creation of debt, because that's how money is created. You know that. That if you go to the bank, like a bank that has a charter from the nation that is allowed by the Federal Reserve to create money, you go to a bank and you say, I want to borrow $10,000 for that used car, and they look at you and say, okay, you're probably a good risk, you have a job, you'll be able to pay it back, and then they just create $10,000 out of thin air digitally and hit enter, and it enters your account because they have the permission to do that. The idea being, of course, that money then gets spent a bunch of times, and this thing called the multiplier effect, and that you end up, creating more monetary velocity, and that stimulates the economy. You have to, in my opinion, you have to stop the creation of money as being something that's done by private institutions, where the private institutions create all the rules. And it's a total lie, by the way, if the Democrats, people on the left, say that they are creating reforms that are going to mitigate the power of these big banks. I mean, that's silliness, because the people on the left, Barack Obama and Tim Geithner and all these people on the liberal side, know that if they really did curtail the power of the Goldman Sachs and the Bank of Americas and the cities and all of these institutions, if they really did put the handcuffs on them and make sure that they couldn't make these billions and billions and billions of dollars gambling in the commodities markets, gambling in the equities markets, et cetera, in the Forex markets, then what would happen is you'd have that precipitous fall of the economy. So you're kind of in a situation where you can't win. It's kind of a no-win deal. And where we stand is, are we going to see a precipitous economic decline in the next 5 to 10 years, or is it going to take 30 or 40 or 50 years? A lot of it depends on who comes to power, who gets elected to Congress, who gets elected to the presidency. A lot of it depends on the types of policies that the Federal Reserve carries out. But understand, a liberal or dovish Federal Reserve that is creating trillions in liquidity is not going to solve the underlying problem. Because the underlying problem is that you have a population that's growing, you have fewer and fewer jobs in the United States that the corporations or businesses or whatever that are making or creating those jobs, the money that's available to pay the workers can't keep up with inflation, and you have people who might get a job and still be in a situation where they're like, wow, I still can't make ends meet. Increasingly, that's this idea of a shrinking middle class. It used to be that a middle class existence, you could make a certain amount of money, and that as someone in the middle class that was sufficient, but it isn't anymore. Because the amount of money it takes to get by is going up, and the amount of money that people in the middle class are making is at best standing still, or in a lot of cases is kind of going down. So, I honestly, I sit here in my comfy chair with my coffee and on a kind of a serious note, there is no good solution. That's where we stand. Yuck. There is no great solution to the monetary predicament in which we find ourselves. I mean, yes, you could have a global revolution where you no longer had supposedly free, if I keep doing this quote thing, you can just, it's really obnoxious of me, where you no longer had free markets supposedly where people were allowed or free to get as wealthy as they wanted to, but that all money was used as a way to trade resources, and that resources were preserved, and that you had a much more equitable, there weren't super wealthy people, but there weren't super poor people, and that, of course, has rife with all kinds of problems because, for obvious reasons, right? You end up with people in power who are lording over those political systems, and they end up benefiting. It ends up benefiting them. I'm not so naive as to not understand that when you have a Soviet-style system, if that is a hierarchical system, the people at the top of the hierarchy impose their will with regard to what is fair and what isn't fair and what is equitable and what isn't equitable, and anybody who goes against that gets put in the gulag, right? Yeah, I understand that. But we're in a very difficult position because we live in a world in which money, which should just be a lubricant for trade and for the exchange of goods, money has become We live in a financialized world where central banks create trillions and trillions to stave off economic contraction, and where those trillions and trillions are captured by just a very tiny portion of the population. And the only people who benefit from that are the people who work on Wall Street, or the ancillary industries to Wall Street, and those service industries that service those people, right? If you build yachts, right? Or if you operate, oh, there's someone jumping around out there. Or if you operate very fancy restaurants that, the top end, these, millionaires and billionaires come to every night because they don't want to stay home and cook. Then you might benefit kind of tangentially. But for the most part, the majority of us, and in the United States it's bad, but it's terrible around the world. It's just disastrous around the world, where you have Western nations and these nations that are super wealthy just exploiting the heck out of the poorer nations for their resources, for their land, for, all. And so you end up with a world in which there's a ton of suffering and a very small group of people who are kind of living off of that. Kind of a parasitic type of deal. Kind of uplifting, isn't it? Anyway, I honestly don't know what the solution is. We elect Barack Obama for a second term, and let's say you had a Democratic administration and a Democratic Congress, and there was very loose monetary policy, and there was a lot of, there were a lot of social programs, and it would seem like for the next 5, 10, 15 years, things were good, or were better, right? There would be a sense that like, oh, this is recovery, but it's actually not recovery, because what it's doing is, and a lot of economists will, a lot of Austrian economists, and we'll use this idea of kicking the can down the road. It's creating more and more liquidity, more and more wealth for fewer and fewer people. It's creating more and more debt that eventually does have to be serviced, unless your eventual plan is to, is to default on your debt. And it's creating a situation in which inflation becomes rampant. You have the cost of goods and services, the cost of certain commodities, food and energy going through the roof, but you have an enormous group of people in the middle class or former middle class who have stagnant wages and who can't afford those things. So that's like the best case scenario. The best case scenario, with a population of 310 million people, the best case scenario is electing a liberal administration that creates as many social programs as it possibly can in the near term, and that continues to promote a loose monetary policy in the near term, so at least for the next 10 or 20 years, there is the quasi-illusion of recovery, and people aren't falling through the cracks. And maybe during that 20 years, you figure out how to change the system so that when things get tough again, and they'll get tough, really tough again, they'll get tougher than they were last time, you have a plan in place to deal with that. On the other hand, if you elect Mitt Romney, or if you elect Newt Gingrich, or one of these clowns to be the next president, and you elect a Republican, a conservative administration, and these people follow through on their austerity-minded, balance the budget and get rid of deficits, etc., what you end up having, and getting rid of social programs and cutting off unemployment insurance, what you end up having is this, and it happens really quickly. So it's either precipitous economic decline or slow but steady erosion of the middle class. Pick your poison. I mean, that's where we are. So, that's why I drink coffee, eat chocolate, enjoy my family, listen to music, dance. The economic future is uncertain for us. It's uncertain. We have created a situation that is very uncertain for ourselves. You cannot have economic recovery based upon the printing of fiat currency and not expect at some point that charade to get called. Right? At some point, the world says, oh, hold on a second. At some point, only a teeny-weeny percentage of people who have parlayed those trillions of dollars into capital wealth, real estate, whatever, are able to then be okay. And you have a really huge amount of people who are like, wow, I truly don't know where the next meal is coming from, and the government can't help me. Think about how many people right now rely upon government assistance, which I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing that the government provides assistance. I am circumspect about how we got here. There are 50 million people who receive some kind of food stamp, SNAP, right? Supplemental nutrition, some kind of subsidy. 50 million Americans. 1 in 7 American children lives below the poverty level, lives in poverty. So those are people who are saying, that's 50 million, 50 million people who are saying, if this subsidy is cut off, where's my next meal coming from? If people who are giving every possible ounce that they can to food pantries stop giving, then people say, I wonder where my next meal's coming from. We don't talk about that a lot. What we talk about is, hey, the Dow Jones was up 137 points today, and you hear Barack Obama disingenuously and dishonestly getting up in front of the people and trying to, hey, we're in an economic recovery. No, we're not. We're not in an economic recovery. We're in a period of loose monetary policy and monetary capture that is keeping us afloat. That's not recovery. It's not recovery. It is delaying a situation in which you're going to see a shrinking middle class or keeping at arm's length a precipitous economic collapse based upon austerity measures. Austerity is the worst possible thing that can happen in the short term. That's why if you plan on electing a Republican, if you believe this idea that, well, we've got to pay our dues at some point, so we might as well do it now. If that's your plan, hunker down. If that's your plan, then you better understand what you're inviting. Because what you're inviting when you have severe austerity in a system in which 50 million people receive food stamp subsidies, and in which you have millions of people on unemployment insurance, and in which you have millions and millions of people who are dependent upon social programs by local and the federal government in order to get by. If you cut those programs, what you end up having is an enormous amount of angry, hungry, roofless people. Not ruthless, roofless people. And in that environment, that's when you get political extremists who come to power. And the angry moderate, as much as I'm sort of admitting that what I'm admitting is the best thing to do is kick the can down the road, right? I mean, what I'm essentially admitting here is that in order to maintain a moderate political system and a moderate political situation in which we're not seeing situation in the streets that is reminiscent of other nations where violence and protests and real destructiveness, the moderate path in the near term is continued liberal monetary policies. It's the moderate path. I wish that weren't the case. What I would like to say is we've got to clean up the debt right now. The debt is going to absolutely, in the end, at some point, it's going to come back to, bite us on the rear end. I mean, what I'd like to be able to say is that we need to get our fiscal house in order and it's not okay to say that right now. That's not okay to say. Because to say that is essentially to say, I'm willing to allow the chips to fall where they may in a nation of 300 plus million people in order to make sure that we have a balanced budget. And that's not okay right now. We have got to continue to have loose monetary policies in the near term, and we've got to continue to have all the social programs in place in the near term. And while we're doing that, our political leaders and our grassroots people, you and me, have got to figure out a way to change the way this thing works so that when the eventual day of reckoning comes, we're not like, oh, weren't expecting that because we thought it was a recovery. It's not a recovery. This is my last thought for today because I got kind of serious here in this last part. I apologize. Last thought. The solution always, always, always lies in your communities. Always. You know that. Always. The Norwich listserv, trading, bartering. Government doesn't like that so much because they want to get some, the tax money. Right? They don't like the idea of barter because barter robs them of revenue, which is a whole other issue because the whole tax thing is a red herring. The whole idea that the government doesn't run on tax revenue. Tax revenue is simply a way to regulate demand and is a way to make sure that the money has any kind of value. If people refuse to have pay their taxes, then the money has no value. it's not like more taxes means more money to spend. I mean, the government can spend it, the Federal Reserve could monetize $2 trillion tomorrow, and the government could disperse those $2 trillion to all the people in the country. I mean, they could do it, right? There would be repercussions, because that would be a pretty inflationary. The cost of a bag of rice would probably be $25, but the government could do that. But everything that we do now in terms of building for the future lies in our communities. And the reason I brought up Norwich is because, just on the listserv, right, where people are bartering and, trading, selling used things, it's this sense that we need to continue to take care of each other and look out for each other, aging in place in Norwich. Take care of each other, watch out for each other, make sure that people aren't falling through the cracks. I tend to believe that physicians in towns like Norwich should get together and open up their homes once a month for, clinics, and where people who are just kind of strapped can go to those clinics and be like, yeah, doc, I've been having trouble. And that in exchange for that, the people who go there and who have certain skills, electrician, carpentry, plumbing, whatever, would exchange those skills for a trip to the clinic. I think that in the communities, because we have the skills, we have the skill sets, that's where a lot of our salvation, it's not the best word, I apologize, that's where a lot of our solutions are going to be found, is in our communities. Because in the end, whether it's a conservative administration and Congress that's pulling the plug on social programs and off the cliff we go, or whether it's a liberal administration that is continuing loose monetary policies but pumping up the inflation goes through the roof, and you have just a teeny weeny group of people who can afford stuff, and the rest of us are like, $5 a gallon for gas? I'm pedaling my bike. Whether it's conservative or liberal, in the end, the federal government is not going to be able to help us. 10, 20, 30 years out, they're just not going to be able to help us. It's not going to happen. 30 years from now, when there are 350 million Americans and 100 million Americans are living on food stamps, it's not going to happen. So in our communities, that's where that's where we help each other out. And Vermont and New Hampshire do a great job with the local VOR movement and local foods, et cetera, and so forth. But we have to keep that up, because in the end, we're going to end up back in that old village kind of society. I don't mean old like non-technological, but I mean where people are really not falling through the cracks because their neighbors are taking care of them. That's what I think. Anyway, that's the Angry Moderate for February 9th, 2012. Thank you for listening. If you did listen for the entire time, I feel sorry for you. I should buy you a drink, but I won't. And that's all I have to say. I hope you have a marvelous rest of the week and weekend and whatever, blah, 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 and peace. Goodbye.